The United States and Cuba were once allies, which seems to be a shock as a result of where they stand currently. At one point, Americans purchased 83% of all Cuban exports. It also had control over Cuba's sugar industry. Ruled under Spain, Cubans were seen as inferior to the large country. They desired independence. Taken to their advantage, the U.S. wanted Cuba to hold naval bases. They also wanted to profit from Cuba's sugarcane crop. The United States fought in the Spanish-American War in order to free Cuba from the clutches of Spain. Passed in 1898, the Teller Amendment would allow the U.S. to take out Spain, but disallowed the annexation of Cuba. Upon the victory of the United States, the Platt Amendment was passed. It gave Cuba independence, but allowed the U.S. to intervene with the government. In 1959, the Cuban revolutionary Fidel Castro rose into power and overthrew the Cuban president Batista. He named Cuba to be the first communist country in the Western Hemisphere. Ever since the start of the Cold War, the United States has feared the spread of communism. They did not want it to reach the Western Hemisphere. Cuba was retained by the Soviet Union. In October of 1960, a partial embargo was signed by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. This act prohibited all U.S. imports into Cuba, with an exception of food and medical supplies. The Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 was passed by President John F. Kennedy. This imposed a total embargo on trade with Cuba. The act banned transport of U.S. goods on ships owned by companies that do business with Cuba. It also prohibited foreign assistance to countries that provide assistance to Cuba. President Kennedy later issued an executive order in February of 1963. This prohibited travel to Cuba and all financial and commercial transactions with Cuba. In 1962, an American U-2 spy plane secretly photographed nuclear missile sites in Cuba being built by the Soviet Union. In reaction to this, Kennedy decided to place a naval blockade around Cuba in order to prevent the Soviets to bring in more military supplies. Kennedy ordered the removal of the missiles present and a demolition of the site. He released a televised address to the nation concerning the missile crisis.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The Cuban embargo has continued for over 50 years. It was originally made to topple Castro. However, it didn't have a large effect on him. Now that the Cold War is over, Cuba isn't a threat to the United States. The removal of the embargo is now being considered. This is now a very political topic being debated over in Congress. President Obama signed the Ominous Operations Act authorizing an easing of travel restrictions. He also inched closer by signing countless other acts. However, many argue that it may make the U.S. seem less of a superpower. Nonetheless, the debating should be left for Congress to decide.